I've been watching American politics for a long time, long enough to think I'd seen every kind of miscalculation a political leader could make. I've seen bad speeches, reckless tweets, unnecessary fights, and self-inflicted wounds that should have been avoided by anyone with even a basic understanding of power. But what unfolded over the past year between the United States and Canada is something different. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a complete failure to understand how people, markets, and nations actually work. Canada was supposed to fold. That was the assumption. Smaller economy, heavily dependent on trade with the United States. The thinking was simple and arrogant. Apply pressure, make threats, insult them publicly, and eventually they would cave. Instead, Canada responded with one of the most devastating economic counterpunches in modern trade history, without firing a single tariff, passing a single law, or holding a single emergency summit. This story isn't really about trade policy, it's about hubris. It's about what happens when a leader mistakes intimidation for strength and assumes that other nations and ordinary people have no agency of their own. Donald Trump believed that bullying would produce compliance. What he never considered is that people don't need permission from their government to push back. Sometimes all they need to do is stop buying. What followed was not a government-ordered retaliation, but a massive grassroots consumer boycott unlike anything seen in decades. And the target of that boycott was not random. It was strategic. It was aimed directly at industries that had financially supported Trump and the Republican Party. American bourbon, American wine, symbols of American culture, now rejected on principle. As this year comes to a close, the consequences are impossible to ignore. Entire industries are in freefall. Workers are paying the price, and the country that was supposed to be crushed is seeing job growth and economic resilience. This is the story of how a political miscalculation turned into an economic disaster, and why the real power in global trade doesn't always sit in government offices. It often sits in the hands of consumers who decide they've had enough. To understand how this spiral began, you have to go back to the moment when restraint disappeared entirely. It wasn't during a tense negotiation or a late-night policy debate. It was on Christmas Day, at a moment when most leaders are at least pretending to emphasize unity and goodwill. Donald Trump chose escalation. He didn't just criticize trade terms. He went after allies themselves, floating the idea that Canada should become the 51st state and openly threatening its sovereignty, economy, and national identity. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a worldview on full display. Trump has always treated international relationships the same way he treated his personal business dealings: dominate, threaten, humiliate, and assume the other side will eventually break. That approach may work when you're dealing with contractors who lack leverage. It does not work when you're dealing with an entire country with a strong sense of identity and millions of citizens capable of making independent choices. What makes this moment even more revealing is what didn't happen next. There was no pushback from the Republican establishment, no public condemnation, no quiet attempt to rein things in. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader from Kentucky, remained silent, even though his own state's signature industry was about to take the brunt of the fallout. The message was clear. Party loyalty mattered more than economic reality. Trump fundamentally misunderstands how respect works. He operates on the assumption that fear produces obedience and that pressure automatically creates leverage. But human behavior doesn't work that way. You can't bully people into friendship. You can't insult a nation and expect its citizens to keep acting as if nothing happened. At some point, people stop listening and start looking for alternatives. That's exactly the miscalculation that set everything in motion. Trump assumed Canada had no choice. He assumed economic dependence meant submission. What he failed to understand is that when you push people far enough, they don't always fight back through governments or formal channels. Sometimes they respond in quieter ways that are far harder to control and far more damaging in the long run. Canada's response didn't come in the form of emergency legislation or dramatic press conferences. There were no sweeping tariffs announced, no formal declarations of retaliation from Ottawa. In fact, the Canadian government barely needed to do anything at all. The real response came from ordinary people, acting on their own, making millions of small decisions that added up to something far more powerful than any trade policy. Canadians didn't wait to be told what to do. They didn't need political leaders to organize a boycott or issue marching orders. They simply stopped buying American products. Bars quietly removed U.S. bourbon from their shelves. Restaurants switched their default spirits. Liquor store customers started asking questions about where products came from and choosing alternatives on purpose. What emerged was the largest consumer boycott in modern Canadian memory, driven not by law, but by principle. This is the part of the story that Trump never anticipated. He sees power as something that flows from the top down. Executive orders, threats, leverage applied through governments. But consumer power works in the opposite direction. It's decentralized, it's voluntary, and once it starts, it's almost impossible to reverse through traditional political tools. You can negotiate with a prime minister. You cannot negotiate with millions of individual shoppers making personal choices. What made the Canadian response especially effective is that it operated completely outside the normal channels of diplomacy. There was nothing for Trump to win back through a deal. No tariff to remove, no regulation to suspend. The boycott existed entirely in the marketplace, where intimidation has no force and demands carry no weight. And once people are pushed into changing their habits, something interesting happens. They discover alternatives. They realize they don't actually need the product they were buying out of routine. Habits that took decades to form can break surprisingly fast when values are involved. Canada's response wasn't loud, but it was disciplined, sustained, and deeply strategic. And it exposed a reality Trump has never understood. Real power often belongs to people who can simply choose to walk away. What happened next makes it clear that this boycott wasn't random, emotional, or unfocused. It was precise. Canadian consumers didn't just stop buying American products across the board. They targeted specific industries, and those choices revealed a level of political awareness that many in Washington underestimated. The bourbon and wine industries weren't just convenient targets, they were symbolic ones. American bourbon is produced primarily in Kentucky, a state represented for decades by Mitch McConnell, one of Donald Trump's most powerful enablers. It's an industry that has poured millions of dollars into Republican campaigns, helped fund Trump's rise, and benefited politically from GOP control. To Canadian consumers, bourbon wasn't just a drink. It was a message. If you want to make political consequences felt, you don't aim at voters, you aim at donors. This is where the boycott became truly dangerous. Bourbon isn't easily replaced in the short term from the producer's perspective, but it's very easy to replace from the consumer's perspective. A bartender doesn't need American whiskey to make a cocktail. A liquor store doesn't need Jim Beam on its shelves to stay in business. The power dynamic flips instantly. Producers are locked into fixed costs, aging inventory, and long production cycles. Consumers can switch brands overnight. By targeting bourbon, Canadians struck at an industry that relies heavily on habit and brand loyalty. For decades, American bourbon had been the default choice in Canadian bars and restaurants. It wasn't something people thought about, it was automatic. But once that default was broken, it forced the industry into unfamiliar territory. Instead of coasting on routine, American producers suddenly had to justify themselves in a market that was no longer willing to separate the product from the politics behind it. The same logic applied to wine and spirits more broadly. These industries had long aligned themselves politically with Republican leadership, assuming those relationships were a safe investment. Canada's boycott shattered that assumption. It demonstrated that political donations can carry downstream risk, and that consumers, especially foreign consumers, are not obligated to ignore the behavior of the leaders those industries choose to support. This wasn't just economic pressure, it was a message written in market behavior. Political choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive not through elections or courts, but through empty shelves and collapsing demand. Once the numbers started coming in, it became impossible to pretend this was anything temporary or exaggerated. The damage wasn't theoretical. It was measurable, immediate, and brutal. The United States didn't just lose ground in the Canadian bourbon market, it lost it almost entirely. Roughly 85% of American bourbon exports to Canada disappeared in a single year. That's not a downturn, that's a collapse. The most visible casualty was Jim Beam, one of the most recognizable names in American spirits. A company that had operated continuously since the 1930s announced it would shut down its main distillery for an entire year. 1,500 union jobs were suddenly thrown into uncertainty, not because of automation or market saturation, but because a major export market simply vanished. The explanations offered by the industry were telling in their desperation. Executives spoke about facility upgrades and inventory management, even as production numbers showed output had already dropped sharply. When you're producing less and still can't sell, the problem isn't supply, it's demand. Jack Daniel's followed with layoffs of its own, citing a 65% drop in Canadian sales, numbers reported before the boycott had even reached full force. Smaller producers didn't have the cushion to absorb that kind of shock. Kentucky Owl Bourbon declared bankruptcy. Others quietly scaled back operations, canceled expansion plans, or froze hiring. What had once been described as a golden age for American whiskey suddenly looked like a mirage. Perhaps the most alarming signal came from the collapse of the barrel market. Aging bourbon barrels, traditionally treated as appreciating assets, became nearly worthless overnight. Courts began rejecting them as collateral. Judges cited testimony showing that even heavily discounted barrels couldn't find buyers. An entire secondary market, one that producers relied on to manage debt and cash flow, simply evaporated. This is how structural damage reveals itself. Not through a single headline, but through cascading failures. When exports disappear, inventories pile up. When inventories pile up, prices fall. When prices fall, assets lose value. And when assets lose value, financing dries up. What Canada's boycott exposed was not a fragile industry, but one built on the assumption that demand would always be there. Once that assumption broke, the entire system followed it down. What makes this collapse especially dangerous for American producers is that it isn't just about lost sales in a single bad year. It's about something far harder to recover: broken habits. For decades, American bourbon didn't have to compete in Canada. It was the default. Bartenders reached for it without thinking. Restaurants built menus around it. Consumers ordered it out of routine, not loyalty. The boycott shattered that routine. When American bourbon disappeared from shelves, Canadian bars and restaurants didn't shut down. They adapted. They experimented. Canadian whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, Scotch, and even Japanese spirits began filling the gap. And something unexpected happened. Customers liked the alternatives. Some preferred them. Others discovered they didn't miss American bourbon at all. This is the nightmare scenario for any brand-driven industry. Once consumers are forced to explore substitutes, many never return. Habits are sticky, but once they break, they rarely snap back into place. Brand loyalty takes years, sometimes generations, to build. It can be destroyed in months. No trade deal can reverse that process. No political announcement can force a bartender to restock a product they've learned to live without. Even if diplomatic relations improved tomorrow, the market wouldn't magically reset. Canadian consumers now ask different questions. Where is this product from? Who does this company support? Do I want my money tied to that? Those questions didn't exist before, and once they enter the buying process, they don't leave easily. This is where Trump's fundamental misunderstanding becomes most obvious. He believes economic pressure is reversible, like a contract negotiation. Push hard, then cut a deal, then move on. But consumer behavior doesn't work that way. When trust is broken and habits change, the damage lingers. Canada's boycott didn't just hurt American bourbon in the short term, it rewired the market, and that kind of change can last for decades. The contrast between the United States and Canada at this point could not be more striking. Canada was supposed to be the country that cracked under pressure. That was the theory behind the threats and the intimidation. Smaller economy, heavy reliance on U.S. trade, apply enough force, and they would have no choice but to surrender. Instead, the opposite happened. While American bourbon producers were announcing shutdowns and layoffs, Canada's economy was quietly posting strong numbers. 54,000 new jobs added in a single month, 3 consecutive months of job growth, unemployment falling to its lowest level in more than a year. Banking analysts began comparing the momentum to periods of rapid expansion not seen since the late 1990s. The country Trump claimed would be crushed was proving far more resilient than expected. In the United States, the picture looked very different. Entire industries tied to export markets were wobbling. Workers in Kentucky were facing layoffs through no fault of their own. The affordability crisis, dismissed by Trump as exaggerated or imaginary, was very real to families watching stable union jobs disappear. And through it all, much of the Republican leadership remained silent. The contrast in political leadership was just as stark. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear spoke openly about the damage being done, calling out misinformation and acknowledging the real economic pain facing his constituents. He didn't hide behind party loyalty or talking points. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell, whose state was absorbing the worst of the fallout, said nothing. His silence became its own statement. This side-by-side comparison shattered the original narrative. Canada wasn't suffering. Canada was adapting. The United States wasn't winning leverage. It was bleeding credibility and jobs. The trade war Trump framed as a show of strength was revealing itself as a self-inflicted wound, one that punished American workers while strengthening the resolve and the economy of the very country he tried to intimidate. As this first year of economic confrontation comes to a close, one truth stands out above everything else. Donald Trump didn't just misjudge a trade partner, he misunderstood power itself. He believed strength came from threats, from humiliation, from forcing others to bend. Canada proved that real power doesn't always sit in government offices or negotiating rooms. Sometimes it lives in the quiet, collective decisions of ordinary people. The symbolism of what happened matters. Bourbon isn't just another export. It's woven into American history and identity. For generations, it represented craftsmanship, tradition, and a certain idea of America abroad. And yet, through sheer diplomatic recklessness, Trump managed to turn that symbol into something Canadian consumers actively rejected, not because of quality, not because of price, but because of principle. The tragedy is who ultimately paid the price, not Trump, not the political elites who cheered him on or stayed silent when he crossed the line. The cost fell on workers, union families in Kentucky who lost stability, security, and income because one man decided to pick a fight with an ally for his own ego. They didn't start this war, and they have no control over how it ends. What Canada demonstrated is something American politics has largely forgotten. Consumers have agency. They cannot be bullied into loyalty. They cannot be ordered to buy. Once they decide to walk away, there is no executive order, no trade deal, and no threat that can force them back. Trump thought he could break Canada. Instead, he exposed how easily arrogance can break American industries, and how long the consequences can last when trust is gone.